Well, good morning, everybody. Great to reconvene. As always, I'd love to see you smile and wave to your fellow panelist or something. Yay, then I know everyone is happy and they're happy to be here. Fantastic. So yes, welcome. We have a full agenda today and super excited to share it with you. Just a couple little housekeeping matters. Trace, our trusted facilitator, is feeling very poorly today. And while she is here working behind the scenes, Jennifer and I will be kind of moving this agenda along for you today. So just wanted to let you know all of that. The other thing, I want to go ahead and take care of some housekeeping matters first. Turning to our agenda, we have meeting minutes for 3 separate meetings that we need to approve and pass. So just a show of hands, I guess, who did not get those 3 sets of meeting minutes? That might be the easier way to approach this. You did not get the meeting minutes. Okay. All right. Elizabeth did not get those. Gina, I'm trying to see. Okay. Everybody else did. So we have 3 sets of meeting minutes, and I think we'll just do it this way. I'm going to take these one at a time, so bear with me. It's going to be a little tedious. Starting with our September 28th, 22 meeting minutes. Is there anybody who has any edits or corrections to those minutes? Please raise your hand. Great. I see lots of head nods. No, fantastic. Again, I'll take these one at a time. If I could have a motion to pass those meeting minutes then, and a second, and then we can vote on those, please. And please say what your name is as you do that.
Becky, so moved.
This is Dennis, I'll second.
Thank you, Dennis. And I'll just say, is there anyone opposed to passing those meeting minutes? Raise your hand. Nobody. Fantastic. Those minutes will pass. Thank you. Moving on to the second set of meeting minutes from November 2nd of 2022. Are there any edits or corrections that need to be made to those minutes? If so, please raise your hand, electronic or real. We still recognize real hands. Anybody? I see no one. All right. If I could also have a motion and a second to pass those, please.
Ashley, I'll move.
And I'll second. This is Gina.
Thank you, Gina. Anybody opposed to the passage of those meeting minutes? Seeing none, those meeting minutes will pass. Thank you. And finally, and third, turning to the January 4th of 2023 meeting minutes, same question. Any edits or corrections that need to be made to that document? Lots of no's. I see nobody concerned. Okay. Again, if we could have a motion and a second, please.
So moved. I move they pass.
Thank you, Kevin.
This is Lynette. I'll second.
Thank you, Lynette. All right. And anybody who is opposed to the passage of those meeting minutes, January 4th of 2023. All right, friends, thank you. I see no objections. All 3 of those will pass. That was very quick and easy. Moving on to the second item that I just wanted to get into before we move on to our next segment of the agenda. I just want to thank many of you for taking the time to chat with me over the last 3 weeks. I was able to set up one-on-ones with about, I'd say 80% of the panel. And I want to thank all of you who we were able to talk. I did have a couple glitches with my technology, and thank you, Anna, for your patience. And same thing with Beth. I'll be circling back with you guys. But overall, I just want to say super helpful conversations. I really had an opportunity to learn more about each one of you. I really appreciated the opportunity to understand nuances about this subject matter and how we as facilitators, right, can bring forward many of your ideas, many of your thoughts, many of your experiences. And so it was just very rich conversations. For those of you that we need to reschedule, we will be following up with you shortly. So again, just my deepest thanks to all of you. I'm much smarter because of all of you that are here. Really, I am. All right, Jen, if you want to go ahead and take over the next segment.
Great, thank you. Good morning, everyone. So one of the challenges that we have is that there are 2 months in between each of these meetings. So I want to just open it up to you and let you know that I will take suggestions for how we can more actively engage you in those off months. I realize if you're anything like me, they come up more quickly than you expect. You're like, well, we're having another meeting.
Testify again today.
Oh, hang on one sec. And then, so, you know, part of what we want to do is help bring you into the conversation and make it easy for you to get back on track instead of having to go through your own notes or have to rewatch the video. I mean, all that's available to you, but I do want to make it as easy as possible. So, you know, as you saw, we sent out a briefing to prep you for this meeting. I will, if you guys want to put in the chat, if you did not get my reminder email, that would be helpful, just so I can try and track that down. Let me just go ahead and get started. So just wanted to quickly summarize for you. Can you all see my PowerPoint presentation? No? Okay. There we go. How's that? All right. So just, you know, sort of as a reminder of where we've been. Again, these meetings have flown by from my end. So in September, we started out listening to the Youth Lived Experience panel and the provider panel. And this was really an opportunity to capture, you know, this qualitative data about what is the issue that we're really trying to address with this task force. In November, we honed in on the structure for this task force, our plan for moving forward, and we reviewed our legislative charges. So this is how we were building up you know, panel input. What was the information that you need to address these legislative charges? And that's something that we'll pull throughout this entire process. And then at our last meeting in January, we heard from our task force members who are part of the county operations. We heard from law enforcement and the providers as far as the protocols that they follow when a child leaves care. We also heard from our researchers, Dr. Tara Richards and Carolyn Branscombe, and they presented their research that covered the national trends and those indicators of runaway behavior. And again, this is us, you know, taking this large look at the issue we're trying to solve and narrowing it down to so that the task force really understands the problem. And as we move forward, has these resources that you can all pull from. So one of the things we wanted to speak with you about, and this has come up in prior meetings as well, and it may have come up in your meetings with Stephanie, is that as we look forward and we look at our legislative charges, there doesn't seem to be enough time to go in depth in a lot of these topic areas. One that I'll mention that's been raised in prior meetings is the law and the protocols regarding seclusion and restraint for children who are trying to leave care. We feel like that needs more in-depth discussion, and yet we have a full docket ahead of us as far as our planned meetings. So what we wanted to propose to you is that we schedule additional meetings in our off months. You know, these would certainly be encouraged. We want to encourage as full a participation as possible. We realize that that's an ask on your time, but we feel like we can be very efficient with our discussions in these off months and really focus the topics on these narrow subject matter so we can really sort these out. So just kind of wanted to propose that to the group, get some feedback. Again, I think it's come up in discussions in prior meetings, and I know that, just from the feedback from the task force members that we've captured, there's a lot of interest in going a little bit more in depth in some of these topic areas.
Yeah, and Jen, if I could just jump in and if you want to just have a bigger group discussion, what it would look like is really just have a standing meeting in our off months, not dissimilar to what we do now. So, right, you pick your Monday or your Tuesday, and we would have the members convene. And then what we were also thinking is that to the extent there are 2 or 3 different topics, right, we could do breakout sessions virtually within that block of time. That way we don't have to schedule 4 different subcommittees on 4 different issues if that's where we end up as a task force. So by way of saying, we are talking about 1 additional meeting that would be very similar in time as this one. And again, how we use that would depend on, again, where the task force wants to go. So with that, Jen, what would you like us to do?
I'd just like to know, are there any task force members that are opposed to this idea, or, are there any additional ideas for how we can accomplish this? Dave?
No, I guess I was just going to say, I think for most people, I'm sure we're willing, and if we're able to, outside of our normally crazy busy schedules, to participate in these. I think it's a great idea to kind of have some individual topic meetings, because those, we have all kinds of different thoughts and opinions on those, and some of these topics can take us into some lengthy conversations that we don't really have time for during these meetings. So I think it's great. I love it. I'm just curious on when those meetings would be scheduled and if they'll fit in people's schedules.
Yeah. We were going to propose the second Wednesday of the off month. Same time. We were going to aim for 2 hours instead of 3, because 3 seems like a big ask. And again, if we're really focused, I think we can accomplish a lot in those 2 hours. So that would be 8 to 10. And I will follow up just to, check and see how that works with everyone's schedules and to flesh out what those topics would look like. But this is just an opportunity, again, if anyone has a different idea for how we can accomplish this. I realize, I think the time together is really valuable. We had, I think this was on our other task force, but the idea that, members could self-select into working groups, but we really wanted to encourage as much participation and diversity of thought on these issues. So I think that's, it seems like the best approach.
Yeah, and I see several comments in the chat. So yes, it looks like people are supportive. Ashley, I just want to follow up on yours as well. We would have targeted smaller subcommittees. That would be the entire point. And so I very much appreciate your comment is, when we get those groups established, and I don't think we're too far from there as we've been strategizing. I agree with you. It wouldn't just be another group meeting. It would be, again, a very targeted approach to very specific issues. So I agree with you there. So thank you.
Great.
Stephanie, I just wanted to clarify from logistics. So like what that technically would look like is we would still, it's really just for a scheduling purpose, right? So instead of scheduling all these different meetings, you come to the large meeting and then we break out into those groups, assuming we have the subcommittees. And so if we need to move folks around, et cetera, instead of chasing down like 8 different calendars. So yeah, but I appreciate that clarification, Ashley.
Absolutely. Okay, so Norma has a conflict that is a standing conflict. Thanks, Norma. We'll note that because we are certainly still way ahead of the game where we can flex. So thank you. Is there anybody else? Just put it in the chat if you can. If there is like a standing meeting that you're like, I cannot leave that meeting with my boss who pays my salary, that won't work. All right.
And sorry, Stephanie, one more thing, and I'm not sure if this was said, but one of the things that our team had talked about was we're going to do this for a few months and then we'll reassess, like what else is needed, et cetera. So if folks along the way have different suggestions, really the idea is that you all are inputting that. We want to try this though, to see if this is really what we need to get across this content. So just wanted to throw that out there as well. This is not like stamped in stone for the next 2 years in exactly this way.
Yeah, I think we just wanted to make sure that we reserve it on your calendar way in advance, months in advance, and then that way we all have flexibility. So yes, I agree. All right, I'm not seeing anything else.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your flexibility on that, and I will follow up. So just wanted to give you a preview today. Trace, I don't know if you've dropped in the chat the link to the agenda for this morning. We are really diving into the meaty part. So the first legislative charge for this group is analyzing the sufficiency of statewide data. This is qualitative and quantitative. Next meeting is in May, and that is when Dr. Kristen Myers will report to the task force about the focus groups. So these are focus groups that she has done with youth currently in out-of-home placement, youth who have aged out, and providers, staff at facilities. So that is going to really capture the qualitative data. We had looked at, the task forces had input on the questions. She was presenting through those focus groups. Today is really about what quantitative data do we have? What's collected, what's reported, what's accessible, how is it collected, and how is it used, and also what are the limitations of the data that we have? So the first topic of our conversation is the use of the term runaway. This is something that has come up in prior meetings. It's been raised by a couple of task force members, and it also came up in the research that was presented at our January meeting. So we'll have a quick conversation about that. We felt like we wanted to go ahead and have that conversation early so that we can try and resolve that. Next, Stephanie will run us through the reporting requirements under state law, federal and state law and regulations. And this is the law that really guides what data needs to be captured and reported. And then we'll hear from CDHS, what data is available on youth who run away from out-of-home placement. Again, how is it collected? How is it used? What are some of the trends that they're seeing? And it's really an opportunity for the task force to interrogate the data, because again, your charge is to analyze the sufficiency of statewide data. We'll also be asking for input from other task force members as far as additional data that might be captured and not necessarily held by CDHS. So trying to get that look at, again, what data is available to us to help the task force address its charge. And then once we hear from CDHS, we'll have some Q&A, and then we'll put you into breakout groups. So this is really your opportunity to think very focused about, again, is this data the data that we need? What is missing? And how are we going to analyze the sufficiency of the data? So that is our plan for today. So I think we can go ahead and start with our discussion again about the use of the term runaway. One of the things I wanted to point out first is that the term runaway is used throughout the research and data as referring to the individual, so the child who goes missing from care, as well as the incident. So a runaway is also a description of, a status for the child, but also the incident itself. The federal law on runaway and homeless youth defines it as a youth, an individual less than 18 years of age who absents him or herself from home or place of legal residence without permission. So part of our discussions to date have been that this puts the onus on the child for their own care. So it's this deficit-based term that assigns a status to a child that implies that, you know, they're in the wrong, right? It also, as brought up by our researchers, it obscures the factors of why they're missing. So when the data reports that a child is a runaway, it doesn't describe the factors that are at play. So was the child or the minor, were they enticed to run away? Are they, you know, does this capture children who have been victimized? So really thinking about, you know, when we use this term runaway, what information are we missing by using this term? The term suggested by our researchers and by other research, I'm thinking specifically about the Children's Bureau briefing that was supplied as part of your reading, suggests children missing from care. So again, you know, this is sort of a trend. I pointed to a comment that Dave Hayes had made in an earlier meeting about how law enforcement has really shifted from talking about overdose deaths to, you know, fentanyl victims. Also, there's this idea of, you know, we don't talk about people committing suicide. We talk about, sorry, Trace, what's the phrase? This comes from a task force that Trace has done. So it's really, again, when you shift the language, it changes your idea about the problem that we're trying to solve and the potential solution. So specifically thinking about, you know, the idea of runaway and how that obscures why a child goes missing from care, we want to make sure that we're capturing all of those factors when we're addressing this problem. Does anyone have anything else to add?
Jen, I might I might just jump in with a simple, like, it's asset-based language, right? It's how we talk about these kids. It's how we coalesce as a group when we're writing this report. It's how we talk about kids when we're having these conversations. You know, the example that we have often heard is, Down syndrome kid versus a child with Down syndrome, right? So you're leading with the child and accounting for any nuances in the conversation. So like Jen outlined, there can be so many, and that's what the researcher talked about in the last meeting too. We could name, I think you named just like one or two, right? But it is so complex why a child might be missing from care. And so there's a lot of nuance to this conversation. So I think it's pretty straightforward though. These are the suggestions we've heard. I know Stephanie, you had actually been the person that brought it up just as a task force member as well in a previous meeting. And then it came up, you know, randomly as well from the researcher, and then we've seen it in research. So want to just really throw it to the group, reactions, thoughts, questions, and want you all to kind of wrestle with this amongst yourselves. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, I disagree. I think runaway is a much better term. It's much more specific. In other words, these kids aren't at a doctor's appointment or something. The burden indeed has to be on the child, be they 6, 8, 12, 14, or 16. That's an inappropriate thing for them to do. And so I have no problem with the term runaway. I've dealt with it for years. If the child leaves my home, are they missing from care? If they leave other places are supposed to be, are they missing from care? So I find the term children missing from care as non-specific and kind of taking us nowhere as far as what the real issue is.
Kevin, I appreciate that point. One thing I'll say back as part of that conversation, and then Dave, want to bring it to you, is the baseline we're working from is that children are a vulnerable population, right? We're talking about kids. And so this is the conversation that the researcher brought up. At the bare minimum, her suggestion was accounting for both. So leaving space for runaway and children missing from care, because to your point, yes, there are children that would be termed runaway by definition, and there are children missing from care that would not. So it's more of the inclusive language piece and creating space for both. So I just want to clarify that there was the suggestion of accounting for the difference between the two as well as a bare minimum approach. It doesn't have to be all children missing. It should be at the bare minimum. There's the definition of runaway, and there are children missing from care. And how do we create space for both of those? So just wanted to name that piece and kind of response. But Dave, want to bring you in. I know you had a response.
No, I think we need to come up with a common definition, whether we use the term runaway or not. I mean, I'll just give you an example for the Division Youth Services that I'm in. We don't use the term runaway. I mean, these kids are in a different legal aspect. And if they run away from a placement, they are actually considered escapees. They could be charged with with that, a little bit different. So, but we have all kinds. I mean, when they leave, we can definitely assign them as children missing from care because they are. So I think whatever term we use, we have to have a common definition. I definitely agree with that for us to collect accurate data from a variety of agencies. We need to have a common definition, whatever you want to call it. So.
Appreciate that, Dave. And Sergeant Cotter, seeing you on chat as well. Also seeing Ashley, I really appreciate your point in the chat, just kind of like clarifying from your perspective. So if I could cue you up behind Sergeant Cotter for for that comment. Sergeant Cotter, go ahead.
So I have to lean towards runaway also, because I think the concern that we're looking at is not children that are out of care. It's really about the children that have chosen to leave. And the runaway sort of gives us that idea that the child of their own decision making, even if it's a poor decision, even if it was an enticed decision, it's of their own decision to leave. And so we're trying to solve that problem. Why are kids choosing to leave? And identify the sources of that. But it keeps us focused on that, because what we're not talking about is we're not talking about kidnapped kids. And we're not talking about kids whose parents have picked them up and taken them over, or removed them from placement, or dropped them off, or abandoned them. We're talking about children who have chose to leave a place that the system at least believed to be a good place for them. And they've chosen to leave. So I don't want to stray away from this idea that and the exigency that comes with other forms of leaving care or not being in the care of a provider. So runaway, I think, really sort of encapsulates that. And I'm open to other ideas, but I just don't want to stray away from, like, the child chose to leave. So what are the things that go into that? And why did the child leave? And how can we prevent that poor decision?
Thanks, Sergeant Cotter. And can I just clarify, it sounds like, so you're wanting clarity around the term runaway, but it sounds like you're open to language that would be inclusive for these other situations that you just referenced, that you named. So it's kind of that, what I'm going back again to the researcher who shared, at a bare minimum, creating a definition for when children are missing from care and when a child is a quote unquote runaway. Is that kind of in service of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think children who are missing from care can go missing for numerous reasons that are well beyond the scope of what we're trying to solve. But a runaway gives us, this child made this decision. So could there be other maybe synonyms to runaways or similar phrases that describe how a child made this decision to leave, that we're trying to solve the kind of come to the root cause of? Sure. And so I'm not stuck to the word runaway, but I definitely want to make sure that we're focused on the start of this was that child's decision. And so how do we get to that bad decision? That's, I think, what this group is really trying to focus on.
And can I just sorry, I have one more question for you. And sorry, Jen, I'm just jumping in, but I have a couple. From a law enforcement perspective, do you know that child, do you know the impetus behind the child's running before you declare them a runaway? Or, you said the kid's making their own choice. And do you account for when there might be more nuance to that? I'm just wondering, like, where that nuance is on the law enforcement side, or if a kid is missing from care, from your perspective, they are a runaway.
So it depends on the facts and the circumstances, right? Like, if the witnesses tell us that a white panel van with a creepy guy said, "Hey kid, get in here, I'll give you some candy," and then drove off, we would call that a kidnapping. We would not call that a runaway. Yes, the child got into the car of their own sort of poor decision, But certainly that was more specifically enticed. Would we know that if the child was maybe of an older age and was just playing around and had a history of leaving without their parents' permission? We could end up in a situation, and often do end up in situations, where it appears to be a runaway by statute, and in fact it was more of an enticement situation. So yeah, all the facts and circumstances around this certainly help us get to that decision. But the reality is there is a large group of children who flat decide, I'm not going back to care today. And that, I think, is the focus of what we're talking about. We're not talking about the kids who are being more specifically being kidnapped or targeted in that way. We're really talking more about the kids who are choosing to leave. And there's definitely a gray area there about why a child chooses to leave on their own. Like, are they leaving something, or are they going towards something? Like, those are things I think the group has to start to flush out. But yeah, from a legal point of view, from a criminal statute or a Title 19 point of view, all of those, yeah, there is a difference between a child that's being sort of pulled away versus a child who is choosing to go towards something.
Thanks, Sergeant Carter. And Jen, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to, I'll hand it back to you after this. I'll just say, if Ashley, if you could come in, I think that you were trying to offer a counter perspective there. So I want to create space for that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think my uncomfortability with the conversation and calling it a runaway is that everything's the child's fault, and you're looking at it in isolation, and that there's nothing that led up to that that made it not the child's fault. By calling them runaway, by the way we're speaking about it, we're talking about, well, the youth made a choice. Well, it's interesting because the youth had no choice typically in being placed there or where they went. They had no choice on if they get to leave or see family or do any of these things. So, not having a choice in any of that, but then their choice to run away is the only choice that we focus on and care about. It doesn't seem to encompass the work, and often, I mean, you guys are talking about this like it's sort of a criminal act and that's it. Then you have to think about the mens rea, right? The intent. And we can't do that obviously until after the fact, but you're also assuming this child's in their right mind or making conscious decisions when sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're not in their right mind at all, and they're reacting and they have no idea what they're doing with their bodies in that space and time. So I just think it's a lot more complex than we make it out when we just blame the child and don't look at the whole picture.
Any other insights?
We have a few folks in the chat. We also have Beth's hand up. Beth, why don't we go to you? But then task force members in the chat, we would love to hear from you directly. I just want to make sure we're getting the richness of your voices here. Go ahead, Beth.
Yeah, so just my own personal experience working with youth, and now overseeing a team of caseworkers who do outreach specifically, and our program's called Runaway Outreach Notification and Intervention. But using the term runaway is an immediate barrier in building rapport and trust with that youth. So I just want to be mindful of that I think it just immediately, I agree with Ashley, it kind of presents this like almost like a criminal, like you've done something wrong, and that prevents the youth from opening up as to getting to the why, as to why they left in the first place.
Janelle, I know you made a comment about making the term bold. Did you have any other thoughts to add about use of the term?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't against runaway or for runaway or, the missing. I do really agree with the sergeant here because, they are two very different things, which makes people look at them very different ways. So I agree with all of that. I don't know if it can be a group term. That's why I'm saying if it is, it has to be bold so it encompasses that. And I don't know if I feel that the other one does, because missing is not the same as runaway. And so it's a hard word to fill to encompass all of that, I guess, is my point. I guess at the end of the day, I don't know if I agree with merging these terms, just because I don't know if it can accurately be expressed in one way. I think they're two different things. But I also agree that kids run for a lot of reasons that we should not put necessarily the blame on them. I've personally worked with many of them that I would have ran too. And so it's a hard thing to tackle. I don't think that either of these terms fit both of the things we're doing. And I don't think we're there yet. I think that we need to still go back to the drawing board. That's just me.
Are there any other terms that are used to describe these kids that we're missing?
I offered up elopement from the medical side. It is
I
a
know.
CBT code.
Yeah.
And it's how
Gina,
it's
we're
described.
actually at this point, Gina, we're just asking for input from task force members. Thank you, though.
What one person said was, I think maybe it was Beth, I don't know, talking about, we're just looking at it like a criminal side of thing. Well, running away isn't a crime. And so was that, I don't know who said that. Like, I don't want us to think that we're thinking runaways are just criminals either, because they're not. I mean, there's not like the runaway police, so I don't know. It's a weird thing to think about, and 3 hours is not enough for me to get.
I know, right? And we are sort of at our limit of the time we allotted for this discussion. So I just want to, I think, this has opened my eyes, because I think you guys have made some really good points about, on the one hand, we don't want to expand the reach of this task force. We're really focused on these kids. But again, the idea that they have a choice is a little bit off as well. And we want to make sure we're capturing all the reasons that they're leaving care. So we will do some more further exploration. And this will be a perfect opportunity to engage you in the next couple of weeks. I was hoping we could do a thumbs up today, but I think, and again, thank you for your input in the chat. We will capture that as well. So there's some additional terms in there and some additional ideas, which we will then put in front of the task force members and revisit. Does that sound good? All right. Thank you, because I love discussions like this. I mean, this is, we are really trying to define and understand this problem. And I think, the conversation around this term is very helpful. All right. So next, Stephanie was going to lead us through some of the laws and regulations that determine the data that's required to be collected around kids who leave care. And Stephanie, I'll pull up your presentation.
Great. Yeah, thanks. This is just a brief legal primer. So first of all, yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm just reading the chat. We will definitely be back to talk about terminology, and I will be working with Trace to figure out what are some out of meeting activities that we can capture some of these comments more deeply and further the conversation. So thank you. I don't want to leave that conversation because I think it's fascinating, but I will. So, I want to go ahead and just start with, first of all, last meeting that we had on January 4th was a really important meeting. We had the opportunity to hear from our members from Departments of Human Services, Lynette, Anna, Michelle, that really talked about what are the protocols for reporting and responding to youth who are recovered from a runaway situation. We also had the opportunity to hear from Brandon, Brian Cotter, Dave Lee, regarding, again, what is law enforcement's response to, again, reporting and responding to youth who run away. Today is just a brief discussion to put legal framework to what all of our task force members talked about in the prior meeting. And so I want to acknowledge, thank you all who spent the time delineating your processes. Because the task force is required to look at the laws surrounding what I'll call runaway youth. We wanted to go ahead and start that primer so that the task force has the actual laws, statutes, regulations that we can refer to as we begin to walk through our work and decide, are our laws sufficient, right? Are they encapsulating all that we need them to do to respond to this issue well for our children? So the primer that I've provided for you today is strictly about reporting requirements and what should be done when children are returned or do return back to care. I'm very careful to say that because there are many, many other laws that we will be discussing. I had a nice conversation with Dr. Marquette this week, and we got into just barely the discussion about the numerous behavioral health laws that we have that guide how individuals in behavioral health facilities must be treated, right? And that includes issues of restraints and seclusions and a whole host of other issues, which we will get to. Those issues have been referred to in bits and pieces throughout our meetings, but I just want to assure you that we have not lost track of that conversation. It's a big one. And again, there are different legal statutes and regulations that we will discuss in that context. So for purposes of today, what we're really talking about is, excuse me, I'm just changing my screen here. Great, is really about, again, what are those requirements regarding reporting, and where it all begins is right here with the federal law. And if we could go to the next slide, Jen. Federal law is what really dictates all of our current state laws and regulations as it relates to youth who run away. As many of you know, especially all our friends within the human service arena, we have federal requirements, right, in order to receive Title IV-E funding for youth and child welfare. The federal government requires our state to create an annual plan about how we're going to comport with various laws and requirements as it relates to youth who are foster care, kids who are in out-of-home care. And so really the federal law dictates and has dictated to us, as you will see here, that we develop and implement specific protocols in the following aspects. We have to have a protocol about expeditiously locating missing youth, determining factors that contributed to a youth's running away, also determining what those experiences were while they were gone, including screening for sex trafficking, and of course, the timeframes in which we must report missing youth to law enforcement. And so what happens is, as a result of this mandate from federal law, our state law is created. And you will see in this next slide that we have really only about 3 different statutes that address what our actions are to respond to youth who are missing. And we also have a big body of law called Volume 7, which is our state human services code, if you will, which is really what I always say is the law is sort of the 30,000-foot view of what is required of various agencies in specific circumstances. The regs provide the actual roadmap on how to get there, right? And regulations are decided internally by committees who meet on these matters and say, hey, how do we want Colorado to implement this law in the human service context? Because we are working with youth in out-of-home placements in the child welfare system, you will see that the law surrounds what the role of human services is primarily as we have this discussion. It's human services and law enforcement primarily. So the very first slide, again, mimics what we heard from our friends a meeting ago, but really it establishes the reporting requirements of what human service agencies must do. And these are agencies that have legal custody of a child. It does require them to report no later than 24 hours, both to law enforcement as well as what we call NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, once they learn about the disappearance of a child. The law that next applies to our law enforcement friends is that once they are notified of a missing child, they have 2 hours in order to notify CBI. And again, I think it's always important for us to look very clearly at some of this language, after learning of the disappearance of a youth. Right. We don't always know when youth have officially disappeared. Right. And so these are issues that I think we'll be getting into more deeply. Additionally, you will see that in Title 19, there are specific reporting requirements for foster parents and out-of-home placements. Again, the law really does distinguish between the individual reporter's role and really their circumstances. And so as you will see here, it's pretty straightforward. Foster families and people in facilities who are in charge of facilities have to notify as soon as possible after a juvenile has run away from those locations. Again, I think it's really important to be clear that, when we say report right away, it's always after the point of discovery. I had the opportunity this week to speak to foster parents. And, it was just very interesting. They're like, we don't always know when youth have, quote, run away, because these youth are in facilities, at school, they're at community activities, right? And so, if they're delayed coming home from school, that is something that may not be reported, quote, immediately, right? That is something that might be reported later in the evening, just to allow a child to be a child. Maybe they got stuck talking to friends. And so I thought that was an interesting takeaway. The other thing, as you can see here, in terms of reporting requirements for out-of-home placement facilities, is, really that's going to look different yet again, because these individuals really have line of sight for these youth, right? They are living on their campuses. They are working with these youth individually in a very sort of confined space, if you will. And so the point of discovery is going to look differently in that context. And actually, I want to go back for just a moment, Jen, if we could. If we could go back just 2 slides. Yeah, one thing that I omitted to talk about when it comes to human service departments, again, we're regulated by state law, but we're also regulated by what we call Volume 7. Something that I did not put in this slide, but that is very important, is that Volume 7 does require our human service friends to make reasonable efforts to locate a youth. It also requires them to document 1 time monthly about what those efforts are and what sort of progress is being made. So I didn't want to omit that from our conversation. So as we think about where data is driven from, as you can see, primarily it is our human service departments who have this duty to report. They have this duty to document ongoing efforts, and we'll go on to their other duties in a couple slides here. So if we could go forward. Great. One of the requirements specifically in, again, Volume 7, again, the Human Service Bible, if you will, requires county departments, determine the factors for why a child runs. This is very aligned with what caseworker activities would look like in the normal course of business, right? If a child returns, yes, we're going to say, why did you return? And to try to figure out how those factors contributed to the child being missing. Again, caseworkers are required to document that into the Trails database. The second thing that caseworkers are required to do, again, is to, according to Volume 7, is that once that child is returned, again, to make reasonable efforts to respond to those factors in their current services and placement. So again, I think it's fairly straightforward. When a child returns, caseworkers naturally would say, maybe this isn't the best place for you, right? Maybe this is not the best home. Are there other places that we can find? Are there other services that would be better for you if you're in a placement in which you're receiving treatment and it still is not perhaps what may be in your best interest? So that is a second piece, a requirement, if you will, of our caseworkers. The third requirement for them is to assess experiences. Again, to determine what did the child experience while they were gone? Were they victims of crime? Were they required to engage in behaviors that were unsafe? Did they lack resources, and how did they find those resources that they needed, including food, shelter, etc. This also includes a requirement by the Human Service Agency to conduct a sex trafficking screen to determine if a child was a victim. And so, as you can see from those very few brief slides, this is the legal guidance that we have that really guides our human services departments, our law enforcement agencies, and our facilities and directors of those facilities. It is not complicated, and yet in its lack of complexity, I would say that there are gaps that our task force should explore as we move forward. When I spoke again, and I'm so grateful for our human services members here, and I'm also grateful to my staff who are all certified caseworkers. They've been incredibly helpful. But one thing they will tell you is that as caseworkers, when they document all of the information that has just been previously required by regulation, they do it in the Trails database in a narrative screen. In other words, they will discuss, in a narrative form, all of these matters that a child experienced, why they ran from care, et cetera. However, that information is not readily reportable because it's in a narrative form. It requires you to go to a specific case, that you're aware of, or you've been pointed to actually pull up that information in order to glean why a child ran or what their experiences were. And as I've spoken to a number of our task force members and even county caseworkers from across the state, they said that this is definitely an impediment to being able to try to prevent this activity. Lynette and I had a very robust conversation about this, and she said, it would be very helpful to know, right? What are the patterns for the youth in our community, right? Do they run at a certain time of year? Do they run to certain locations? Are they running from a certain provider, right? I mean, these are all data points as we consider how we want to think about prevention efforts. So really, the fact that this data is locked down, if you will, in a way that is not easily extracted is one of the challenges that we face. The second challenge that we often have is really that right now state law and regulations doesn't have any sort of guidance on when these cases, these human service cases, can be closed, right? And my understanding from discussions with a number of jurisdictions is that those cases can stay open a year, but there's also been reports that they can be closed sooner. Again, potentially it's a factor for us to consider as we want to really understand who's running away, where they're going. We're potentially losing data by closing down these cases and not having the ability to reference back and really assess what those children's experiences are. And just the last thing, I think one of the gaps that I noticed in my analysis is that all of this runaway law and regulation primarily derives from anti-trafficking sources, right? It really, if you look at the federal level, so much of the guidance we've received is in response to combating human trafficking for youth. And we don't have much guidance in regulation or in law that really talks to us about other experiences, right, that we should be examining, or what other criminal activity, for example, have youth potentially been subjected to that we need to know about, right, to keep kids safe. Or alternatively, youth with behavioral health disorders, right? What do we need to know about them and what caused them to run as well? And so I think that the rules and the regs are written pretty broadly, right? And I appreciate that. Caseworkers are experienced. They are designed to ask a lot of questions and try to work with youth and find out all they can to serve them the best. And I would say there isn't a lot of distinct guidance either in law and rule about the various possibilities that could take. I will stop there, and I see a couple hands up. Just wanted to point out again, this is where I would say is sort of the starting point for our analysis. And as we consider our data today, I think it's pretty clear that when our laws require and put the greatest onus on our human service departments, right, it's natural that that is going to be the primary source for data for us. Again, I've had the opportunity to speak to many of you here as well as outside of this screen. And while I understand various agencies may keep pieces of data, right, to work within their communities, those pieces of data will look differently depending on your jurisdiction, your human service agency, your law enforcement agencies, et cetera. So by way of saying, I don't want to suggest that only, right, human service data is all we have. I understand there's a variety of other data sources. However, it would be the one single source that we can consistently count on in terms of a legal framework. So I will stop there. And Lynette, please.
I just wanted to clarify one thing. There may not be a rule on how long the placement stays open for a youth that is on the run, but there is a payroll rule that you're only allowed to pay for placement for 7 days when a youth is not there. So the placement gets closed within 7 days.
Yep.
So I think that's important to know. I think these youth present a lot of challenges. There was a research study, and I'll send that to you, done in, I believe it was Louisiana. I could be wrong. It could be a neighboring state, where law enforcement used a tool to identify what youth went through while they were on the run, why they ran and why they came back. It's a simple 10-question tool set. I tried really hard to get our law enforcement to use this tool set with all youth that run away from home and run away from placement. They chose not to. Unfortunately, they thought it would just be too much extra work, but it is definitely something that could be easily instituted in child welfare. It's 10 questions, so it doesn't take 3 days to complete all the information, and might get to some of that data that you're talking about. So I'll send that to you.
Thank you, Lynette. I appreciate that. And did you say, I'm sorry, did you say that was Louisiana? Did you say that to me?
That's what I think it is. It might be one of the neighboring states.
Thank you. I think that could be very helpful. Okay, yep, Brian, we'll get that actually out to the whole group. No worries. Thank you. Any
Stephanie?
Questions?
I'm
Yes.
seeing the question in the chat from Ashley of just asking if anybody knows where payroll rules come from. Is that from volume 7?
Anybody? Dennis, maybe? Could you help us with that question?
Sorry, coming off mute. I think that is in volume 7. So, but I'll check and make sure.
And just so I'm clear, what would those rules tell me, Dennis? Precisely, what do they measure?
I'm gonna have to, I think it would be better if I deferred to Lori Burney on that.
Okay, that's fine. Yes, thank you. Sorry, didn't want to put people on the spot. I think this is an interesting topic and I'm not aware of the issues involved. Yes, I want to get to you, Jenna, and then Norma.
Sure. Hi there. So Safi is working with a university in Florida, and Dr. Crossland, who was actually in one of the articles that you sent out, I believe, for January. We're working with her and her team to pilot an assessment for our kiddos that go AWOL. So when they return, we do a pretty in-depth interview with them to see what things they like about running, what things they don't like about running, and really trying to get to that root cause analysis of why they're leaving. So like I said, it's still in the pilot phase, but I know that she is a really big advocate for this. So I think she would also be someone that could come and share knowledge if that's of anybody's interest. And then as they gather more data from this assessment, I'm happy to report that and share that out.
Great. And Jenna, just for everyone's record, could you please just give us the full name of your agency and what you do?
Mm-hmm. So we are Specialized Alternatives for Families and Youth. So it's It's a mouthful. And we are first and foremost a CPA. And we also have an intensive in-home family services program, and we run mobile crisis in our southern counties.
Great, thanks, Jenna. And yes, Jenna was kind enough to share information with me about this ongoing developments of this assessment tool. So thank you, Jenna, and we will definitely be wrapping back with you. Norma.
So I don't know if this is important or not, but I just think that in general, the funding streams don't allow for us for providers to really look for kids. It's meaning that, so for example, if we had a child that we were providing in-home services to through Medicaid and that child left their home, we then immediately have to close the case. So we can't continue to work with parents to help them, identify places where the child may be, or prepare for the child to come back so that we have a really clear plan about what that will look like, things like that, if that makes sense.
Actually, Norma, that makes tremendous sense. And so I really appreciate that, because that was one thing I think I neglected to say in the presentation is we do have laws, right, that require this reporting and even this documentation. And that's where it ends, right? There's no other guidance for us on what I shouldn't say that. There is some loose guidance on how we might prevent a run, but there are no resources, if you will, for that purpose. And the fact that, Norma, you've identified that there's actual federal regulations governing services that could implicate that is very useful. And so definitely made a big note on that. So thank you, Norma. Other folks, we've got like 3 screens of people. Let's see, anybody else? I'm looking at my chat as well to see, okay, I think we've got everybody covered.
I think that's everyone.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you all. Again, I think it's always important. I know I have a bias as a lawyer, but I always think it's important to ground the work on what we're required to do as professionals in these circumstances, and then spread out from there about what does practice look like, what do resources look like, and what are those other challenges, ones like Norma's identified, that prohibit us or challenge us, right, from following the law, from keeping the types of information that might help us solve problems like this. So thank you all. And with that, I will turn it over to, I think there's a break. Is that right?
Yes, we have a break. So let's all take 5 minutes, stretch break, get our eyes off the screen, and we'll see you back here at 9:11. All right, I know that was a quick 5 minutes. So next up, again, we're here to address that first legislative charge about the sufficiency of statewide data. Specifically, it's the sufficiency of statewide data that measures the quantitative and the qualitative experiences of children who have run away from out-of-home placement. I had chatted with a few task force members to see where the data lies. It seems like the bulk of the data gets captured by CDHS. So I reached out to CDHS, and luckily, Lori Burney and Jessica Starr were very willing and able to address this particular issue. This data reflects a lot of the work that CDHS has done internally. Lori had mentioned that they had done a study on runaways a few years ago. So it's an important reminder that all of our work is building on work that's already happening and has happened in the past. So this is the task force's opportunity to see what data exists and to see if the data answers the questions that we have. I think it was a couple meetings ago, we had kind of run through what are the questions that you're hoping to answer through the work of this task force. So this is, again, is an opportunity for to put the data in front of the task force and really interrogate it. As prep for this meeting, we shared the OIG report, which sort of outlines some of the challenges of collecting data on these kids. So keep that in the back of your mind as well. And we'll go ahead and let Lori and Jessica present. And then we will go to some, well, actually we'll look at, what other data exists from other agencies, and then we'll go to some Q&A. So Lori and Jessica, if you want to take it away, and I will let you share your screen.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, great to have you here. Thank you. Do you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Sure. My name is Jessica Starr, and I am the Research Analysis and Data Unit Manager over at the Division of Child Welfare. And really what my unit does is we really conduct a lot of that data supervision for the 64 different counties, the 64 different county departments. So we are the ones that are really looking at the data on the back end of that child welfare database. And so looking at different measures, where data is being entered and how we can use that data. Lori?
Yes, good morning, everyone. My name is Lori Burney. I am the Provider Performance Manager within the Division of Child Welfare. I work alongside with Dennis Asperis, who's also on this call and is a task force member. Our unit is responsible for the licensing and monitoring of all the providers who provide services in out-of-home care, particularly our residential providers, as well as our child placement agencies who oversee foster homes. Additionally, we also oversee the day treatment facilities throughout the state of Colorado. So, and that does include with our child placement agencies, we also oversee adoption agencies that provide both domestic and international adoption services. So, yeah, so thank you for having us. We'll go ahead and get started. Stephanie, thank you so much. She did a great job. She, presented you with some of the rules and regulations through the federal government, as well as touch base on some of the Volume 7. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Volume 7 rules and regulations and what pertains, Stephanie. So some of this is a little bit of a repeat, but I'm going to go into what the responsibility of the providers is, as that their responsibilities are as well.
Yeah, and it looks like I'm still waiting to be able to share my screen.
Sorry about that. Trace, can you help? Because I'm not seeing that I have the ability to.
Should be good now, Jessica, if you want to try again.
Perfect. Got it. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Here we go.
Looks great.
Perfect.
Okay.
So then going into current rules.
There you go. All right. So next slide. There you are. So this is on Volume 7, as Stephanie was mentioning. She mentioned it as the Human Services Bible. And these are the rules and regulations that both our county partners as well as our licensed providers, ones I just spoke of, that my team and our unit is responsible for overseeing. When we ask them, when we establish guidelines, this is Volume 7, where they go to find their rules and regulations and what the state requires of them. So we actually, we shared this PowerPoint with Jennifer, and so it will be put online. So you'll be able to click on these links to where the Volume 7 rules are located, as well as the ROM data that Jessica will go over here in a moment. So the Volume 7 rules and regulations, obviously, are rules and regulations for both our counties and providers. And there are specific rules and regulations in there specific to runaways. So in addition, the federal government also requires states to report on children and youth in out-of-home placement and enter the runaway status. So not only do we do that, and it was identifying, some of the trails requirements, and I believe somebody brought up that there were payroll rules. There are many rules surrounding what is required, not only from us as the State Department, but also the feds. So the federal government requires that states report on children and youth in out-of-home placement that run away, particularly through AFCARS, which is referred to as the Adoption Foster Care Analysis and Reporting System. It requires that states track our runaways for youth that are being served in out-of-home care. This is accomplished in Colorado in that if a child or youth runs away from their placement, that placement is inundated and a new runaway authorization is opened. What that means is that in our trail system, once a youth is reported that a youth runs away, the caseworker is responsible to indate that placement service in our trail system. Our trail database system is where we gather and store all of our data throughout the state. Our providers have access to this, as well as our county partners. And we'll talk about that when we go through the volume 7, but that is where information is reported, and that is where Jessica was talking about how her team gathers information, and then that is put into another ROM database that is available to the public and online. So we will, Jessica can speak to that a little bit more in a little while. The next slide. Okay, so these are the volume 7 rules and regulations that our providers are required to follow. Again, our providers are licensed agencies and facilities, being our child placement agencies, as well as our residential facilities. And then I mentioned a little while ago that we also oversee day treatment facilities, which is our educational facilities. So part of our rules and regulations, the one noted for 7.708.52b, that's specifically for our foster care or child placement agencies. So what this is identifying is that the foster care home where a child is residing shall notify the parents, guardians, or placing authority as soon as possible upon discovery that a foster child has run away. There are also requirements within Rule and Regulation Volume 7 that child placement agencies also have rules and regulations that they are required to train their foster parents on, so that they can ensure that reporting is taking place immediately. And so that is contained within their policies and procedures. So they also, foster homes, not only are they required to notify the placing authority, but there also are requirements with each CPA to notify them as well. And so that is done, you know, so we make sure that all reporting is taking place and that we get the information to the correct source. And that is the placing authority. Because they have a responsibility as well that Stephanie touched on, and I'll touch on in just a moment. The next rule and regulation is 7.714.933b. That is specific to our facilities. When I refer to our facilities, again, that's our day treatment facilities, residential childcare facilities, group homes, our qualified residential treatment programs, also known as QRTPs, and also our PRTFs, which are psychiatric residential treatment facilities. We also oversee secure facilities where children are locked up, and those are for youth that are adjudicated and under the Division of Youth Services. Those, we do not have any of those currently. Secure facilities. So under our purview, the licensing purview, VYS has lockup facilities, but we currently do not have any privatized licensed facilities under the secure. So I did not add that into this. So with the responsibility of our facilities, they shall notify the legal guardian and or placing authority as soon as possible upon discovery that a child has run away. So when my team is out looking and we know about runaways, we're looking, when we see this as soon as possible, we're looking within the hour, no longer than 2 hours, for this to be reported by both our foster homes as well as our facilities. The next rule and regulation, and this is where it gets very, very confusing for many, because there are responsibilities of our providers to the State Department as well as to the county departments. And that's done through, with the county departments, it's done through contracts as well as rule and regulation. Remember, we are a state supervised county administered system. And what that means is that a lot of the ongoing care, direct care is done by our county departments as well as our facilities and agencies. Our role is to provide supervision over both of these entities. In the Division of Child Welfare, we oversee both the county departments as well as our licensed facilities and agencies. So this is the reporting criteria that takes place when our providers must report to the State Department. But they are, and I'll get into the notifications, well, as we notice here, that they have to report to the placing authority immediately. That is the responsibility. Where they need to report to us as the State Department is within 24 hours, excluding weekends and holidays. So if the incident takes place on a Friday, they have until at 5, they have until Monday at 5 to report to us. So within 24 hours, excluding weekends and holidays, the occurrence of a critical incident at the facility, or within 24 hours of a child's return to the facility, they must report if a child leaves without consent if under the age of 18 and does not return to the facility or foster home within 24 hours. Again, this is notification to the State Department, not notification to the county department. The reason why we have this 24-hour, number one, our critical incidents are required, we give them 24 hours minus weekends and holidays, but we also highlight here that only if the youth is gone from the facility for more than 24 hours. And the reason why this is number one, there's work being done without the state notification. But the rules of definition was derived from a runaway walkaway group that involved department staff, counties, and providers that we hosted in 2013 and 14. And they defined what a walkaway was and a runaway. And a runaway was anyone that was gone for more than 24 hours, or a youth, I should say, that was gone for more than 24 hours. The walkaway is what was identified because these youth, obviously in our facilities, are in there for treatment, for behavioral reasons, for mental health reasons. Many have experienced abuse and neglect, and that's part of their trauma. But when they're in our facilities, it is because of their behaviors and their mental health issues. And sometimes what it was defined in this work group is that kids sometimes need a break. And if they walk outside the facility and walk down the block, right, that's not necessarily considered a walkaway, or not considered a runaway. It was considered a walkaway. So those are our current definitions within the Colorado Department of Human Services. Next slide. So these are the rules, the county rules and regulations. And Stephanie, I think she'd already touched base on some of these and let you know that, so as we are identifying, if a foster parent calls and or a facility calls the county department then is responsible to notify, well, first of all, they must notify the court of jurisdiction or other parties within 10 calendar days of receipt of a report. That is part of the rule and regulation. So that's notifying the court system who is granted custody to the county department. They must notify them within 10 calendar days. However, the county does have a more immediate response. So when they are notified of a runaway, they must report immediately and no later than 24 hours after receiving notification. And they're notifying the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. We want to make sure that these children get on a database that is available to all law enforcement across all states, so that in the event that a child is able to make it across state lines, that other law enforcement it can know that this child is a runaway from the Colorado system. They also must document these details in the state automated case management system, which I referred to earlier as trails. The other point of the rule and regulation is that the county department is responsible for making reasonable efforts to locate the child and youth who is missing and document those efforts a minimum of once per month in the state automated case management system, again known as trails. And then third, upon return of the child, they must make reasonable efforts to complete the following activities and document these efforts in trails. They must try to determine what are the primary factors that contributed to the youth missing. And we talked about this earlier, right? That's the why. Why did this happen? Because we're trying to prevent this from happening again, particularly with this youth as they move forward in their treatment or wherever they will be placed next. They also must determine the youth experiences while missing, including contacting sex trafficking screening to determine if the child is a possible sex trafficking victim, if possibly they were involved with drugs and alcohol, you know, what exactly were their experiences while on the run, and do we need to get further assessments or further resources to help them with their possible traumatic experiences that they face while out on the run. And then, as he says, it talks about responding to factors identified in A and B above in current and subsequent services, which that means is that if the child is to remain wherever they ran from, maybe they, you know, as Stephanie was identifying earlier, right? It's talking with the child, finding out, is this the most appropriate placement? Is this, you know, why did they run? That's why they must find that answer out first. Why did they run? And if it is because, you know, they're struggling within the placement, right? It might be that the caseworker begins to explore with them, you know, other alternatives for placement and so forth. Or maybe the child just says, hey, I just needed a break. I'm okay with this. I just didn't want to deal with treatment. And then that is where, you know, they may remain in that placement. But nonetheless, it is the responsibility of the caseworker to work in partnership with the where the child is being placed, right? Whatever facility, foster home or whatever, to ensure that they're receiving subsequent services, that it's added to their child individualized plan, which is their roadmap for treatment, and what needs to happen. Really maybe identifying their triggers, what triggered them to run and so forth, and adding that as part of their child individualized plan, that then in turn is the roadmap for staff and therapists to be able to treat that youth. So there are a lot of rules and regulations that go along with not just runaways, but the treatment of youth that sometimes get overlooked in these kinds of conversations. But I'm happy to, you know, at some point come back and talk about those. But Volume 7 really does expand, you know, much further than just the runaway, but there are responsibilities of our providers to treat that specific, you know, the why. Why is it that they're running away, and to treat and help them find some, you know, better coping skills than running from treatment or running from their issues. Okay, and that is part of the rules and regulations. Are there any questions that anyone has before Jessica begins speaking about the data?
I'm seeing Dave
right.
with his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, Lori, David Lee with Division Youth Services. You know, I've had a lot of experience with Volume 7, but I'm really curious about maybe a little off topic. What is the process of possibly changing something, one of the regulations within Volume 7, and how long does that take?
That is a very, very good question. We obviously have a number of, well, we have a very long process, right? And Dave, you work primarily with, right, the DYS, you know, you guys have a very different process when I'm not coming up with the name. What do you call them? The
Well, we
the
have our
DYS
policy and regulations within our youth centers. We're not actually required to follow volume 7, but we have a lot of step down programs that are licensed facilities and QRTPs. I'm just kind of curious. I mean, they're all following that. I'm just, yeah, like I say, I'm curious about what it would take, because I have a feeling we might go there at some point with this task force about whether it's possible to change something within volume 7 and just what's the process and how long it takes.
Lori, can I jump in real quick?
Yes, go ahead.
Lori, can you hear me? Sorry, this is Trace. Dave, appreciate that question. I want to get Lori, I want to give you a chance to answer that, but then I really want to make, I see a few folks' hands up. The real bulk of this conversation though is around this data piece. And so I want to make sure we have the opportunity and the time to get into that. And we've only got about 15 minutes left for you all before we're supposed to be breaking out. So I'd say answer that. And then I'm going to ask everyone else to kind of halt on going down this piece, and certainly opportunities, down the road to come back and continue to engage in this conversation. But I want to make sure we're able to spend some real time digging into the data. Go ahead, Lori, sorry.
No problem. Thank you. So basically, to answer your question, we make recommendations for regulations, or our outside stakeholders can also make recommendations for rules and regulations, and those must be approved through our state board. Depending on who is involved and that type of thing, depends on how long that can take. It can take from a few months up to a year. Our state board meets regularly and so forth, and so then they look at the rules and regulations being proposed, and then they can choose to adopt them or ask them to be revised, or to they may not even approve them. So and we have a lot of processes where we are required to do stakeholder feedback and gather that information and research prior to submitting our proposed rules to state board. Go ahead, Brandon.
Hi, everyone. Just a quick question. Do we track any data on kids that are traditional or system runaways, like they continue to run away from provider to provider and then all of a sudden stop, and the reasons they stop to the next provider? I think we work off the assumption that we're being less successful as providers than we might be. Because I mean, 95% of my kids that come into our facility have runaway history of some sort from providers. And you're talking like the runaways from our facility, or what we classify, are usually 1 or 2 kids at any given time out of our entire census and population. So the success of the kids not running that were traditional runners is a lot higher. So I'm wondering, do we collect anything on those scenarios from the county? And I know the facility we don't necessarily do that, but I'm wondering if counties do, or the state.
Right. And Brandon, as Jessica begins to speak, and you'll see some of the data that we collect both on our providers and the county, and what's being documented in the Trails system. So Jessica will be able to answer that question. And I want to go back to Dave as well. He mentioned that some of the DYS children and youth do enter into our public provider world, right? And so what does that mean with regard to rule and regulation? They must adhere to both the DYS standards as well as the Volume 7 rules and regulations. And if they contradict one another, they must take the higher standard. So I wanted to mention that. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Jessica for her to be able to present on the data, because she has some information.
Thank you. Thanks, Lori. And also, Brandon, really actually good question. I'm glad you asked that, because I feel like the data is actually going to go into that. So kind of like when we start into the data, I always go through this with my unit. when we're looking at the data, particularly like from the child welfare system, we also have to keep in mind that this is person data, that this is data about people. And so when we're looking at counts, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. I think it's easy to kind of almost depersonalize the data and see counts versus understanding like, this is going to be a count about a child or a youth that is experiencing a runaway that's being reported either by a provider or by a county. So I think that's just really important to keep in mind that when we're looking at this data, to keep in mind that there are people behind this information. So starting off, this information is really based off on the provider side. So this is looking at runaway critical incidences by calendar year. So each one of these data sets is going to be going from 2018 to 2022. All this data as well is focused on child welfare only population. So we're not including the DYS population. We're only looking at child welfare, children and youth. And to note specifically about this data, you're going to see a really interesting curve from 2018 to 2019. And a huge chunk of that is that the critical incident reporting, which you might also hear as CIR, which includes runaways, was implemented on January 1st of 2018. And prior to January 1st of 2018, licensed providers were not required to report on runaways through critical incident reporting. And so you're going to see 2018, if this was the start of the period, 2019 is really where you can say the reporting became regulated and the reporting really was following under those new requirements. So I just really want to give that part of that explanation of why you see that jump from 2018 to 2019 was that there was a new set of reporting standards that providers really started following. However, when we're looking at 2019 through 2022, we are seeing a decline really heavily from 2020 through 2021 being that largest decline. And there's a couple of hypotheses around what was that decline in the number of critical incidents for runaways. We have a couple of major factors. One being our Family First. With the implementation of Family First in October of 21, it was designed to really keep children and youth at home as much as possible and to provide preventative and rehabilitative services to these children and youth and their families. This could have supported that continued decline from 2021 through 2022 in youth being placed in congregate care. So we know that the ceiling for congregate care went down, so there's less kids in congregate care and out-of-home placement, which also meant like the runaway population was also decreasing. Therefore, there was also going to be less reports of runaways if there's less runaways overall. We also had the implementation of trauma-informed care plans. And the other big one that I think this group really needs to look at, along with really any long-term data that we've been looking at, particularly when it comes to 2020 through 2022, is also the impact of COVID-19. The pandemic had an impact, not just on Colorado child welfare data, but also nationwide child welfare data. I've been in discussions with other states. They've all had pretty uniform impacts to their reporting populations on COVID-19. So I would really encourage that when we're looking at this data to continue looking at it into 2023, 2024, because we are having to measure what the impacts of COVID-19 were on the entire population, knowing that there were the changes made for face-to-face contacts, knowing about how facilities and providers were trying to control the spread of the virus. I think that's something that's really important to consider. And then this is really getting into, Brandon, what you were talking about when we're looking at county entered data. This is looking at the total number of children entering runaway spans and the total unique run spans. The difference in this is this blue line right here on the bottom. This is the total number of unique children and youth that had a runaway during each calendar year. However, this red line right here is pointing towards what Brandon mentioned, where there are some children and youth that will have more than one runaway span in a given year. So we can see, for example, in 2020, there were 410 unique children and youth that went into runaway. However, of those 410, were 600 total runaway spans. So you can say that there were some children and youth that had at least more than one runaway span. This is done this is really able to be calculated because each runaway span is able to be linked to a given child, and we're able to see every single span a child or youth has ever had. So along with being able to look at placement history, so like placement, we have every single provider has their own unique identifier. We're able to see the provider that child has been within an out-of-home placement. We're also able to see each runaway span, so the begin date and the end date of the runaway, what provider they ran from, and then also what provider they were placed in after they came back from runaway. So all that data is available, and we're able to look at that by child. I think it's really important to consider if we're trying to look at, multiple runaway spans, trying to see, are there patterns? It's really important to look at, and it's also really important to think of in terms of data privacy. Like the data I'm showing you today is all aggregate level information, because we're not ever sharing individual level information. It's when we're doing that's typically with a data sharing agreement or something where we're making sure that the data stays safe. In this case, we're going to be looking at more aggregate or group level data. Other information really for this slide is also to consider one, the pandemic again, and the effect that it would have had in the number of runaways. And then also considering, which we'll go into the next slide, that again, the total number of children in out of home has been decreasing. Since 2018, the total number of children and youth in out of home placement during a given year has dropped from 9,600 to 6,700. So we're looking at a decrease of 3,000 children and youth that are in out of home placement during a given year. So already we know that is a massive drop. However, this one is looking at the rate of children and youth that are entering runaway. So looking at these counts, particularly this blue line, divided by the total out of home population, because what we want to see is for a given year, what's the total percentage of youth that are running away? What we ended up finding was even though the total out of home population is decreasing, the runaway population is actually decreasing at a faster rate than the out of home population. So if we think of the out of home population, I'm going to be using my hands. So take a look at the camera. Essentially, your out of home population has been decreasing like this. In comparison, the children entering runaway out of the entire population is decreasing like this at a much faster rate. So we're looking from 2018, a percentage of about 5.5% of the total out-of-home population would have a runaway, versus 2022, it went down to 4%, which I'll say it's good to have less runaways over time, because that means, one, we're able to account for where that child is at their placement. I also want to echo what Stephanie brought up, where if a child does go on runaway, that there does have to be that NCMEC notification. So was it the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has to be notified, and we're able to have the dates of when they were notified. But there's also the sex trafficking screening as well. And I will say for this group to know, it's really useful to understand that along with kind of like the general trafficking screening, it also asks questions around, has this child ran away before? Has this youth ran away before? What's their length of their longest runaway span? And, has the youth ran away, 2 or more times? So they're looking at multiple runaway spans. They're wanting to look at the length of the runaway spans as well. And that's something that can be easily calculated because for each runaway span, again, we're able to look at the beginning of the runaway, the end of the runaway, where they were placed after, where they ran from. All that information is available. So I just wanted really to have this as kind of a brief overview of looking at our entire runaway population, but also looking at the data that's entered by providers versus this data that's going to be entered by our counties. And I'm happy to take some questions.
Becky, why don't you go ahead? I see your hand up and I'll scroll the screen here.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks, Jessica. This is really interesting data and it's good to see it. For the purposes of this data, are we defining out-of-home placement as residential or CPA and residential, or are DYS numbers in here? That's just a bigger number than other reports I'm seeing in state government talk. Just curious.
Yeah. So out-of-home placement for everyone on this call, we define out-of-home placement as that essentially the county has custody of that child or youth. So there must be that removal of custody, and the county currently holds that custody. So that could be the child or youth could be with a provider like a family foster home. They could be with residential level of care, group home or group center, could also be with kinship. There is an exception to that where if the child is placed with kin, but the custody is still held by that child's family, it's not going to be out of home placement. The custody must be held by the county. DYS is specifically not in this population because I'm under child welfare, my unit is child welfare. We can only really speak to child welfare data. I will say that Jennifer's data, I think that data is also from ROM. It's our results-oriented management system that we use to transform child welfare data into reports that different counties can use. That looks at the data by month. So by month, I want to say the runaway population is going to be like 1%. However, if you look at it, essentially add everything into the entire year, a child could be on a runaway for, let's say, 2 months. But if you look at it per the year, they'll be counted once. However, if you look at it by the months, they could be counted for 1 month in January, 1 month in February. So overall by month, it's going to be 1%. However, if you look at the number of unique children, overall right now, that's going to be 4%.
Thanks, Jessica. Brandon.
Sorry. Yeah, so it would be interesting to get the DYS data. And because I think it's important to know, I mean, most of those kids theoretically are going to be our highest risk kids in the DYS system in a lot of ways. And my assumption would be, at least when we used to have DYS kids in community for our facility, is they run less frequently. And as we're looking for solutions, you would have to, I guess, wonder why that is the case when you have kids that are so severe and significant. And I'm guessing that comes back to deterrence levels and limits being, set, which I think is important for this discussion as we're trying to solve some of these kids that are running away out of the child welfare system.
Brandon, I think that's an excellent point to make. Again, it's my unit. It's kind of like we're kind of like the data experts for child welfare. I would say that in order to bring in the DYS data, I'd want to bring in someone specifically on the DYS data team, because I would just want to make sure like there's not because I don't know if there's differences in their data, even though we both exist in the trail system. In the case of if there's areas around their data where I'm not exactly sure if I'm pulling it right, I'd want to make sure that they have involvement and that they're able to pull the data and be able to share it.
Thank you, Jessica. Let's go to Janelle, Kevin, and Beth.
And sorry, Janelle, before you go, Jessica, would you mind stopping to share your screen for a minute, just so that we can, looks like we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yep.
I don't know. Okay, let me lower my hand. I had just one question, because I really piqued my interest when you were talking about how, Family First Act, and now we're seeing a decrease in runaways, but we've also seen a decrease in placement. So I feel like that needs to be noted. So maybe children are in placements that maybe sometimes they shouldn't be, so they're not running, and maybe they're not. There's just a lot of different factors there for me to wrap my head around. And then the other one is this just equating to, like, you're just getting the data obviously from what's been called in? Because there's a lot of situations, at least I know in my work, where kids aren't called in at all. So it can't even go on the data to be reported as runaways.
Right. And we can only report what's in the system. So if it's not reported, or if it's not entered in the system, it's not possible for us to be able to pull that data. And again, it is really important to note, like, there has been a drastic drop in that out-of-home population. But also, go ahead.
Do you think that's because of Family First Act and lack of placements? Like, I guess I'm just wondering, are you guys seeing this data as a success to Family First Act?
I would say that there's a lot. So I want to say probably the largest decrease has been around congregate care. I want to say we've had a significant reduction in the past 10 years. But I think a lot of it isn't captured on here. There's a lot of prevention services that aren't captured in this data, which would prevent out-of-home placement in the first place.
Yeah.
So there's going to be essentially more prevention cases that are opening up, which I know that we definitely noted that in our work study going on. But I don't know how much we can speak to it, because I also have to think about the other outside impacts. Like, I am really noting COVID has had a major impact on the data. And I want to say, when we talk about removals, we're talking about county custody. I also know for a period of time as well, a lot of the courts were closed during COVID.
Yeah, where are they going to run? Because nobody can go anywhere because everything was closed.
Right. So it's just, we really also have to look at as many impacts as possible, because there's a lot of factors that have impacted this data. And it's just, unfortunately, COVID happened at the same time as Family First, as in a lot of other programs as well. So that's why I've been advocating for a long period to be able to evaluate the information. Because we had a lot of emergencies and a lot of acts all happen at the same time.
Totally understandable. I was just asking for some clarity around those things. And I'm signing off and getting back on my phone because I have to get in the car. So thank you.
All right, we have Kevin, Beth, Norma, and then I think we will have to close up since we are getting to about time.
Yeah, I just had a question to clarify. Maybe I misunderstood. I heard that kinship, if they're placed with kinship, which I assume is some kind of distal family member, then that's counted in the data. But if they're placed with family, then they're not counted in the data. Did I hear that right? Or did I understand? I'm not sure what kinship really is, maybe.
Yeah, so that is a really good question. I will say that is also initially confusing for a lot of the analysts on our team. So I'm glad you're asking that. So kinship in Colorado, that can be a family member. So let's say aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa. That could also be like essentially a non-blood relative or very close friend of the family. A lot of times that could be like a coach or someone very close to the family. There's a couple of different ways that Colorado looks at kinship. So if they're going to be in this population out of home, there must be a removal of essentially the custodial removal, and the essentially the county holds the custody of that child. If the county holds the custody of that child, no matter what, they're going to be counted in this population. However, there can also be kinship placement. So for example, child can go to aunt and uncle. But the family of origin still holds on to that custody. Because they still have the custody, they will not be part of this population because the county does not have the custody. They don't have the placement custody. Does that make sense? We're really looking at this in terms of who has custody, the family or the county.
Great.
That adds a little clarity.
Great. Beth.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. So is there a mandate on a time frame when a caseworker makes contact with youth upon them returning?
Let's see.
I see Lynette saying no.
No, there's not.
Yeah.
I mean, common practice and best practices as soon as you can, but sometimes the placements are 300-400 miles away, depending on which county you're working out of and where the youth is placed. So phone calls, staff meetings, video conferences are typically done fairly soon, but the mandate, the rule is only the contact has to be at least a minimum of monthly in person.
Okay, and then I guess I'm curious if that's tracked as to, I guess kind of success rate, right? Of like, what's the average time of that contact after the youth is returned? And then comparing that to the potential of that youth going on the run again prior to having any contact by that caseworker.
Yeah. So that data can be tracked. So for contacts, those are going to be essentially tracked by the youth that is being contacted, whether that contact was successful or not successful. If it was face-to-face or not face-to-face, and we all have a bunch of different types of how that contact was conducted, and then the date and the time. So if we're thinking that we can see when a run starts and a run ends, we know that we have those dates. But then we also have dates of attempted contacts and completed contacts as well. So by that, you could be looking at date differences and essentially spans of how long it took to make that contact.
Okay. And then my other question in regards, like, you know, you mentioning in what the HRV tool tracks and all of that for the trafficking concern. My only concern is, you know, there's not a set mandate on in training on how to use the tool. So really it depends on how detailed information you get. It's a case by case, you know, depending on who's filling it out. And then also on trails and a lot of systems that are used, you know, it forces you to say yes or no, as opposed to, so, I mean, you know, that's part of my responsibilities is reviewing a lot of HRV tools. And so I'll get a ton that just say completely no. And after talking with the screener, it's because they weren't allowed to say unknown or even to elaborate. Let's say at that time that they did that screening, the youth was not engaging with those questions. And that's drastically different versus, you know, you don't know versus no, this is not a safety risk. So have you guys looked at potentially changing that or having that capability in trails to expand that with the tool?
Beth, I'm going to take that feedback back because I mean, that's really important feedback to have, because if caseworkers are the ones that are entering that data and they're having difficulties with even the choices presented, I think that's really important to bring back to the team that's able to make those changes. I do know that trails changes take time. So I don't think it could be immediate changes, but I think it's, if that is the experience that caseworkers are having, I think that's really critical if that tool is listed under volume 7 as being used to help track.
Great, thank you, Beth. And so I'm the last hand up. So first, before we close this session, first of all, Lori and Jessica, thank you. Honestly, we could probably have you here for 3 hours straight. And so I don't want this to be goodbye. I appreciate you giving us this very deep information. We're going to be going into work groups shortly, and I have a feeling it's going to generate a number of other questions. And so if you would be our guest again in the future, I think we would all be very appreciative of that, since this is a lot of information to unravel. So thank you. And just lastly, I think my question is this. When we talk about data, right, and Lori, thank you for the beautiful discussion on volume 7. It's deep, right? And when we're saying that caseworkers need to secure pretty deep information, right, about like what was your experience when you were gone, or even demographic data. Jessica, what is your ability or the system's ability to capture that deeper information, whether it's demographic data, a youth's experience while they were on the run, etc.?
So I will say, if we think of Trails as kind of like a set of encyclopedias, essentially, Trails is the child welfare and DYS database, but on the child welfare side is really what I'm talking about. There's an entire encyclopedia essentially just dedicated to kind of like a child's demographics, who they are. Essentially, each child has their own unique identifier. So each person in the Trail system has their own unique identifier, which can also list their demographics, birth date. Then you can link that, and for example, you can see, how many runaway spans have they had, what placements have they been at, what kind of services have they had over time. So that data, I would say, is available. And then, what was the second part of your question?
Oh gosh, I probably don't even remember it. Yeah, I think it was just a matter of understanding for this task force, what is that additional data that we could request from your agency?
Okay, I just remembered the second part of your question. For the child's experience, thank you. It was the child's experience. I would think that might be, I would assume, in probably notes, which notes, I would say text searching. The problem with text searching can be, it can give you false positives and false negatives. But I think really taking into account the child's and youth experience is important, because they're the ones that are experiencing the run. They're the one that essentially have that runaway span, are being contacted by that caseworker. In the case of, I don't know how well text search would work, but I think it might be a good idea if we can contact those with lived experience. So youth and young adults that may have aged out, or, have essentially left the system, maybe adults now, and we're able to maybe hear their experiences and why they ran and what they experienced. Because I worry about text searches, but I wonder, because they would be the primary source and the person with that lived experience, it might be good to hear from them as well. So on one hand, we have the data that we have. On the other hand, it may not necessarily point to that lived experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, Jessica, that's helpful. And I know our team will be back in touch, maybe summarizing very clearly, right? Here are the fields that CDHS can and has filled out, right, in terms of data. And then perhaps we'll make a list internally about, what are those other sources? And, we are pursuing a lot of the lived experience work with some outside research institutions. So anyway, thank you very much. And is there anything, I'm just going to do a quick scan of my screen. Okay, I don't see anything else. So again, my deepest thanks to both Jessica and Lori. Very, very informative conversation. So, and you're welcome to stay as we move into our groups. With that, Trace, how does this group thing work?
Yeah, so a couple things. We have a note catcher that we're hoping can just act as a tool for you all to capture your thinking as a group. So really, when you get into the groups, please just, someone who's comfortable taking notes, I'm going to drop that in the chat. And you'll see your groups, you'll see your name next to your group, and then you'll see kind of 2 prompting questions. But also we created those questions before we heard your questions and dialogue today with the presenters. And so if something else comes up, I've made an additional notes column. If those questions don't make sense for you or you have additional thoughts, please just put them in the additional column. But really, we're going to use that to really go back as a team to make sure we're capturing what additional questions do you have? Where do we need to dig deeper? What do we need to present more on? So that's really the purpose there. You're going to be in breakout groups for 25 minutes. We'll come back right after 10:30. And I'm going to keep members of the public currently in the room, but I'll assign you once everybody else gets sorted, and you can go and be listening in to the groups as they have their conversations. Any questions from a process perspective there? Okay. So really, again, we're wanting you're going to have to kind of facilitate yourselves on this one a little bit. There's a number of groups jumping in and looking at these questions, but really just saying reactions to their presentation, but also beyond digging deeper into the data. So I'm going to drop the link in now for a Google Doc for everyone to access. And then it'll take 1 minute for folks to get in, and then I will send you to your breakout rooms. Stephanie, Jen, Jordan, anything to add?
No, Trace, this is all hocus pocus to me, so I'm just following your lead.
Okay, all right.
I'm sorry, this is Norma, could you repeat what you just said? Because I'm going to try to follow your lead, but
yeah,
I'm a little technically challenged.
No worries, Norma. And you'll be part of a group. So there will be somebody in your group, I'm guessing, that's going to feel comfortable on the tech side. But I've dropped in a link into the chat. That's a Google Doc. You're going to see your name and your group where folks are going to be taking notes, answering these 2 key questions, but also additional questions or thoughts that you might have as a group. We're going to take 25 minutes, come back right after 10:30, and have a little bit of a debrief as a whole group, depending on time. And then we'll close things out from there. Is that helpful, Norma?
Sorry, yep, it is actually, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Okay, the link is dropped. Looks like we're good there. And I'm going to open up all the rooms now. It should kick you in there automatically, but if it doesn't, you might have to click on the breakout rooms tab at the bottom of your screen. And that should be open now. Welcome back. Hi, Elizabeth. It's nice to see you, by the way. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Welcome back. Welcome back. We'll wait just a few minutes. I think some people are coming in at the very tail end.
Rest.
I think we've got, just waiting to make sure we have everybody here. Perfect. All right, two quick things. One, if you're a member of the public and you're intending on giving public comment, we certainly welcome that and would love to hear from you. And so please just drop me a note in the chat so that we can plan accordingly with the time we have remaining. For the groups that just broke out, appreciate, we've been kind of watching all the notes. Looks like there was some great conversations happening. I want to, we're coming back for a kind of a debrief here, and Jen, jump in too. But I want to drop back in just as a reminder, and as we continue to steer this ship, as Stephanie says, we could spend hours and days and months and years on so many pieces of this conversation and all the different intersections we have with the system. And we have very specific charges that we are looking to answer as a task force as we build this report. And so I just want to couch us back in that charge as we continue this conversation, analyzing the sufficiency of statewide data that measures the quantitative and qualitative experiences of children who have run away from out-of-home placement. So I'm just going to go down. We've got 4 groups to hear from. Hopefully, I'm gonna just ask that someone just volunteers from their group to speak up around conversations, key questions, general, if there were general themes in your group, but just want to share out and hear from one another back here. So start with group 1, and I might get, or Sergeant Cotter, go ahead if you had a question.
No, I was gonna volunteer.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so Sergeant Cotter, you were in group 2, looks like with Dennis, Kevin, Renee, and Stephanie. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay, would love to
So
hear.
our general sentiment is that the data that we have really quantifies kind of a volume. It doesn't really tell us much more than that. Looking at some of the CBI data, I see it kind of does the same thing. They run on Tuesdays and they run on Thursdays, and I don't think that's the pattern that this group is really trying to determine. Like, should we, put up guards on Wednesdays at noon because that's when the run happens. And so while it gives us a sense of the volume, it's not complete enough to really be actionable, especially in a group like this. Some of the questions we felt like it was the data is deficient in is what do children who are on the run do? Like, where do they go? What drew them there? Once they walk out of the facility or the placement, what's happening next? I wanted to see the comparison between what's the volume of children who are in placement who run compared to children who are not in placement and who run, because I think that can help us understand, is there something unique about these kids, or is there something not unique? And maybe this is more of a children running in general. I think our gut tells us something, but I think the data could give us a solid answer. We had a couple of, well, first of all, the data that we do have doesn't distinguish with the variability in children who are running and who are in placement. There is so many circumstances that put a child into placement that we really can't say definitively, this solution works for that kid, or this is the cause. We really need a lot of data to help get there. And so we found that the data doesn't distinguish between types of placement, types of abuse, neglect circumstances, and other factors that potentially could be analyzed. And we bounced around 2 big ideas. One, like check the box sort of trails, database sort of analysis. And then another idea that we tossed out was putting together like a detailed time limited, like, 1 month, 6 months, kind of time-based analysis of every kid that runs from a place to see how much information that could give us. So not a historical review, but like a detailed study into the kids that ran during that window, in hopes that could give us something. We really felt like,
sorry, real quick, a quick question about your comment about trails. And then I'm gonna pause you because I got to move to these other groups, but appreciate you sharing out these themes. And again, folks can see in the doc as well what folks are sharing. But the piece about trails, are you saying like almost an analysis of the way data is and is not captured in trails, narrative versus quantitative, et cetera? Or what? Just say more about that real quick.
Yeah, the impression I got from the group as we were bouncing around is we wanted something that you could sink your teeth into on trails. So probably data fields, whether they be multiple choice, whether you check the box, something that then could be analyzed. And narratives just don't give us that as an effective tool. I think there's probably some really great caseworkers and really great counties that demand certain things of caseworkers, that if we looked at those reports, we could answer the questions we're asking. But those narratives don't lend themselves to that. So I think we could spend an entire task force around what exact data to collect in trails, but I think that's kind of what we're saying, is we need to figure out what data to collect and then see if trails can collect it in an analyzable form.
Sure. Okay. Thanks so much. Appreciate that. Gonna move on to group number 3. It looks like Becky, Brandon, Jana, Lynette, and Janelle. Who wants to talk?
So I took the notes, so I'll talk. We really talked about how the current data doesn't really tell us anything about a youth's experience while they're on the run. That's clearly a problem. How do you address an issue if you have no information about what the issues are? It tells us how large the problem is, though, and how rampant it is. And it's nice to know that it is decreasing. I wonder if the variables in that factor of it decreasing have to do with the fact that placements don't like to take youth that run away, or will not take youth that have active substance use issues. And so those youth are left at home, and they are definitely running away from their homes. So I just always look at the confounding variables and don't take things at face value, is my point. We also talked about, going back here, the complex issues of treatment, and the issue is multifaceted. So there is no statewide system for gathering uniform information or a standard tool for youth when they return from a run, or for providers when the youth leave. We've talked about getting the information from the youth when they return, but what information can we gather from the providers when the youth leave? What was going on for them? Did they just hit a moment in their therapy where they are more likely to act out because it just became very real to them and they're struggling emotionally? And that's important information to know, because if that's when youth are running, that's where our interventions could be the most effective. And then we kind of got off on a tangent on the third one. And I'm not going to go through it all, but it's good information. We did talk about what are the actual barriers about locking facilities. And we also did talk a little bit about how trauma-informed care is not uniform and often misrepresented. And is the state doing a good enough job as providers as a whole and the state as a whole in making sure that that basis for our treatment is actually as effective as it could be? So a little bit of a tangent, had nothing to do with data.
No, I appreciate that. Certainly a valid part of the conversation. So really appreciate you raising that. Lynette, also the first part of your comments, I was just sitting here thinking, well, Lynette's just writing the report with some of these key questions and analysis of where data is and where it's not. Certainly, you know, on our end, or what our team is now tasked to do is, I'm hearing the key questions of like, we're not hearing anything about qualitative experience. My question is, does that mean it's, to Stephanie's point, this isn't the end all be all data that we just heard, and does that data exist? It sounds like that's the real question here, is like, where is that qualitative data? And to be able to just say if it doesn't exist. So thanks, Lynette. I appreciate that. I'm gonna move on. I'm not really seeing any comments from, I'm only seeing one note from Kristen for public comment, which will be pretty quick. So I'm just gonna keep us going with this share out. Gonna move us to group 4, Annabeth, Chase, Michelle, and Norma.
Yeah, I can go for us. I feel like a lot of things that have already been mentioned by the other two groups is what we had similar discussions. I think we also talked about, obviously if it's feasible, we recognize that the placement really comes down to like that available bed, or, as discussed, like, whether or not that foster parent's willing to take that youth in, but being very intentional on that placement and the location of placement, and having a plan B established from go. Kind of establishing and wanting to hear from the youth, like, we talked about like doing that, like a phone check-in and doing that screen over the phone just feels probably very impersonal, and wanting to hear from the youth whether or not that face-to-face is better off. And then let's see here, breaking down kind of, with the reasonable efforts in locating the youth, what has worked for caseworkers, and being able to track that potentially with the data, and then really establishing if we're able to, as to what works, having that be implemented as a training across the board. And then finally, the last part we kind of discussed is like, how is really, information being shared across all of these partner organizations, specifically, DHS and law enforcement.
Thanks, Beth. I really appreciate that. And just with a couple minutes left, I'm going to move us up to group 1. I believe that's Chelsea, Elizabeth, Jenna, and Ashley.
Yeah, not much else to add. I think one thing that we saw was just having data by county and or facility. So kind of breaking that down so you can see some themes and things like that. So I think really most of the other stuff was covered. So.
Thanks, Jenna. And I'll just say, looking through here quickly, obviously the big theme in my brain is the data as presented thus far, and that you have available to you as a task force does not tell you much, if anything, about youth's experience when they run away, and also potentially when they return. What everyone, I'm kind of seeing some head nods. Okay, that feels like the biggest theme I just want to take away as far as due diligence of ensuring that we're surfacing the data we need to, And that would be, and if that data does not exist for us to surface, that would be obviously a major part of answering that that prompt, or sorry, that charge of what data exists. And that's the work of this task force, is being able to say it doesn't exist, and this is what we need to be able to make informed decisions. Stephanie, anything to add here? I know that we were excited to kind of have this conversation and dig in, and just want to bring you in. Any thoughts you want to share before we kind of close this out?
No, I mean, I really appreciate the conversation and just all the various nuances, that have been brought up. I also just wanted to mention one other theme, and I was in Brian's group, that I think was important, and it was by Kevin Lash. And it was this discussion we had about how much does data matter, right? I think that and I'm paraphrasing Kevin, and maybe very badly, but it really was, how much is the why matter, right? How much does data about the why kids run matter? And he gave an example in his own life with his own son about how he wished we could just prevent the runaway behavior from happening, which would allow us then to get to the why, which is, making sure that kids are getting the treatment that they need or the services, and they're not being an interruption to that service provision. So for example, if a child is in an RCCF and they've hit a treatment block, right, and they run because that's an uncomfortable time in life, right, they're also losing services on the back end when they do that, and delaying their overall goals or treatment. And so is the why as important, why they're running in the moment, right? Or is the question we should focus on, why don't we cease the runs and then get to the why? And so I just wanted to make sure, because I thought that was a bit of an important question to ask, and just wanted to leave the group with that.
Thanks, Stephanie. That's perfect.
So Trace, thank you. No, I have nothing else to add. I will just say, as we close, this has been a really rich conversation. You've given us all a great deal of information to consider. And so we will take all this back. We will figure out, how we summarize this conversation, not only the data we have, but the data that we feel as a group is missing. And then the bigger question, does the missing data matter? If so, how? If not, why not? Right? And then how do we move forward in light of the information we have today? So I think these are huge questions, but I think this conversation has summed it up well.
Stephanie, I'm going to add 2 quick housekeeping items. One, so you'll receive a calendar invite for the quote unquote off month meetings. There is no off month, I guess, is the new thing. And we'll send that to you. And again, we'll reassess after a few of those around, is this the right cadence, or we meet in the moment? Please respond accordingly to the calendar invite, how you intend to participate. So if you can be there, please accept. If you will not be there, please decline, just so that we can keep a running tally of just understanding who to expect. The second piece is Kristen Myers. Are you still on the call, Kristen?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Hey, Kristen, do you want to just give a quick announcement around your focus group?
You bet. Yeah, I love hearing all this conversation about the qualitative data, because that is happening currently. So I'm glad to say that you will have quite some rich data. Have already done 2 focus groups with staff and 3 focus groups with youth that are currently in treatment facilities, and running one tomorrow for our older youth, age 18 to 22. So I will put the Zoom link in there for that. And that is at 1 p.m. tomorrow via Zoom. And anyone 18 to 22 with lived experience is welcome to join. Thank you.
Kristen, can I pop in really quick? Sorry, I'm going out of order, Trace. Kristen, do you have enough folks for tomorrow's session, or do you need us to try to get more?
I don't know. I have not heard from anyone. I've heard from a couple of the providers saying that they put the word out to young people for us. And I know, thank you to Becky for sending that out to the listserv. So it definitely has been advertised, but I haven't heard back in terms of anybody who's coming or not coming. If I end up with a ton of response, then I might schedule another one and make some smaller groups. But just wait and see, I guess.
So Kristen, just to repeat, and I'm sorry, I type madly during these sessions. Our task force is invited to participate and or observe this focus group tomorrow. Is that accurate? I'm not following. I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I just
no, this is just to get the word out for older youth who might want to participate. Yeah, we haven't had, there's been some staff that have been involved in the younger focus groups, but I'm trying to keep that to a minimum in terms of people that are not participating on the call.
Absolutely. That's what I suspected. I'm sorry. I just didn't hear it all. Thank you.
No worries.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen and Becky. It sounds like another prompting email would do no harm. So appreciate you doing that, and appreciate the rest of the task force and trying to make sure that we're able to get a good amount of youth voice to these groups. So thanks for sharing with your networks. Any other members of the public have any public comment? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but I just wanted to make sure. Okay. All right. So like I said, I will be sending out calendar invites for the upcoming meetings. Really appreciate the rich discussion today and the push on what you need to see in order to make informed analysis for this data, and just appreciate your time. And Stephanie, I'll hand it to you to just officially close us out.
Yeah. Again, just thank you. Good to see all of you again. I will be continuing to reach out to all of you individually, but of course, and I really do sincerely mean this, we've scratched the surface today. And if you want to have a deeper conversation, please text me, email me, call me, because this really does help inform our agendas and how we can meet our ultimate goals. So please feel free to do that. And thank you. That's all I have.
All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.
Goodbye.